Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me for the first time Charles Hugh Smith. I've been picking up on Charles' work primarily. I've accessed it through Zero Hedge over the past couple of years, and his work has resonated very truthfully to me, and I found it to be very helpful. And I suggested to my wife, Teresa, who helps me greatly on this show, to see if we could get Charles on the show, and she was able to do that, so I'm delighted that he's with us today. Now, while I have learned to know Charles through Zero Hedge, you can go directly to of2minds.com, of2minds.com. He's got a blog there. He has several books that he sells through that website, and also is something called his musings that are there. Very worthwhile. So you don't have to go through Zero Hedge. You can go directly to of2minds.com. Charles is also a contributing editor to peakprosperity.com, which, of course, listeners of this show are very familiar with. Chris Martenson was on with us just a couple of weeks back. Charles is the author of numerous books, including Why Everything is Falling Apart, an unconventional guide to investing in troubled times. And his latest book is titled Money and Work Unchained, in which he addresses the ideas of universal basic income, which I want to ask him about momentarily. Charles, thanks for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Jay.
Really good to have you with me while you're closer. Here you're on the mainland. You live in Hawaii part of the time and in California part of the time, so we caught you when you're in our country. Well, yes. I don't know if it's our country. Hawaii is our country, too, but it seems so detached in some ways and culturally so different, I suppose. Before we begin talking about some of the items I'd like to ask you about today, inflation being one of them, other matters of the day that are related to that, can you give us an overview of your latest book and tell our listeners where and how they can purchase it at of2minds.com. But talk to us a little bit about your latest book, Money and Work Unchained.
Okay, Jay. The reason why I wrote the book was a lot of my readers have been asking for my opinion on universal basic income, which is, as we all know, has been getting a lot of publicity by a lot of high-profile individuals like Bill Gates and other tech billionaires, that this is the solution to automation, replacing human labor and basically wiping out tens of millions of jobs, is to give every person, every adult, like $1,000 a month. The amount, of course, can vary, but and this will give people the means to continue, paying their essential bills. And this is considered the solution. And I question that, because I think what we really need as human beings is we need meaningful work and a positive social role. And so what I propose is what we should guarantee is meaningful work and a positive social role in our community, that a chance to earn money and earn a livelihood and earn self-respect, and not just give us a check.
Yeah, I mean, what is life if you just have money coming in? What's the purpose of it all? Aren't we supposed to be? I mean, I know that I feel happiest when I feel like I'm doing something useful for others, not just collecting money. I'm sure you feel the same.
I think it's a universal, and I'm sort of surprised that so many people see this free money, universal basic income, as a solution. They seem not to notice that humans actually are social animals, and we want to contribute to our community and earn our way, not just live off robots or whatever the source of all this money is supposed to be.
I can't imagine it. Well, it's I think certainly an interesting book, and maybe once I have a chance to read it, we have you back on and we could ask you some more about it, talk about it some more, because I think it's. But again, it's of2minds.com. If you pick up a copy of the book there, and I think you have it. It's both electronic and hard copy, right?
Yeah, and it's on Amazon.com along with all my other books.
Good, excellent. All right. Well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the cost of living. In fact, you wrote a piece on December 5th, The Cost Basis for Our Economy is Spinning Out of Control. We've had John Williams, I don't know if you know John Williams, an independent economist on this show, and he's pointed out he's been a critic of the government's inflation numbers, hedonic pricing, substitution, various other gimmicks that are used to make it look as if the cost of living isn't going up very much. We're told that it's around, it's less than 2%. The Fed wants to get it up, wants actually inflation to increase to 2% or something like that. We're told it's much lower than that. But judging from your article on December 5th, I think you think it's already much higher than 2%, at least for most average people. Is that right?
Right. And again, trying to sort through the data is always a challenge because it's often, as John has pointed out, it's been adjusted in ways that are opaque to us normal people. Mm-hmm. But I've read studies in which the rate seems to be, if you include places where rents are rising and the cost of housing is rising, that the rate is more like 7% a year. Mm-hmm. At least for those households that are exposed to healthcare costs, which are rising steadily, and rents or higher housing costs.
Yeah, you in your article you pointed out healthcare is really a big one, and what I found really interesting is a massive departure in terms of the ratio of doctors to administrators. Is that a big part of the reason that healthcare is going up so much? This infrastructure, the people, the regulators, the reporting that needs to be done, or what's going on here?
Well, if you speak to people in the healthcare industry, both the insurance side and also the caregivers, the doctors and nurses, they all complain about the tremendous increase in paperwork and paper mm-hmm. shuffling. And so some estimates are that roughly half of all of our healthcare expenses in America are related to counterclaims and claims and paper shuffling, along with the fraud that often goes undetected in our system. But I think my larger point here, Jay, was that in times of widespread prosperity, mm-hmm. costs are low. And we saw this in America in the 50s and 60s. And if you go back, you can go back as far as the Roman Empire. And when prosperity was widespread in ancient cultures as well as modern cultures, prices are low, and money is sound, and inflation is modest. And you can see historical examples, as I say, going back several thousand years, or as recently as 19th century Britain, where prices didn't really change for most of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So you got to keep more of your money in the sense that your money retained its purchasing power, and you actually could save or invest some because costs were stable and low.
Yeah. Well, we certainly, sound money is certainly something we don't know anything about these days, and the people at the Federal Reserve don't know about it or don't want to know about it. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Why have we gone off track? I'm old enough to remember when we still had a quasi-gold standard. I remember very plainly reading the New York Times coming from New Jersey into New York City the day after Nixon spoke to the nation, and we went off the gold standard temporarily, he said. And ever since then, of course, we've seen credit cards start to become common, credit and debt growing exponentially. As a matter of fact, debt is one of the items in your article that you pointed out. It's just growing, student debt and other things. How do we get back to sound money? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any sense of it because most people don't, most economists even, they think that times are good when prices are rising.
Right. And that works well if wages are rising at a faster rate than costs. But mm-hmm. if as we all know, the wages for about the bottom 90% of the American population have not really risen for at least a decade or 15 years, and in some measurements it's been 30 years since there were actual increases in household income. Earned income. Mm-hmm. So what we have is the worst of all possible worlds, if you will, which is stagnant wages and rapidly rising essential costs. In other words, we're not talking about the cost of new shoes or something. Right. And of course, everyone likes to point out, well, the cost of new TVs is declining, but you need a new TV every few years, and it costs like $200. But what about healthcare that can cost tens of thousands per year, or a college education which can cost $100,000, or rent or a house which can. So we're talking about the big ticket items here.
Yeah.
The ones that you can't really escape. And so if those are soaring in price, our cost, then we would have a real problem. And I think that's what the Fed is failing to recognize as the core issue here. And so then we go back to your question about the ratio of administrators to actual healthcare staff, and we see the same thing in higher education. That there's charts that show the huge increase in the number of highly paid administrators in colleges and universities. While the number of people actually in the classroom has been, stagnant. It hasn't gone anywhere.
Well, it seems to me that, the notion, and again, I'm old enough to remember when not everybody went to college, and I was pretty much at the time when more and more people started going, went to Rutgers and then to Baruch College in New York City to get my master's degree. But there seems to be a racket. It just seems to be like everybody's got to go to college, and who cares if you learn anything? That doesn't matter. If you're not taught to think, that doesn't matter. Just get that piece of paper, and then by golly, you should be assured of streets paved with gold, I guess. And how did we get into this? How did we get into this racket? If you agree that it is a racket, it seems to be like a racket to me. Right.
I think it's undeniable once you look at the numbers. And there was a big study called Academically Adrift, which found that roughly half of all college students really didn't learn all that much, in their 4 years. So obviously the system is not really is not achieving its educational goals, and it's burdening a whole generation with extremely high student loans. But I think we can maybe look at why are these rackets continuing? Why is there no real competition in the higher education? Why is there so little competition in healthcare? And so I think my answer is, well, we've allowed these cartels to basically gain political and financial power. And so, a cartel means like it's all the competitors agree on a price. And so they basically limit competition to sort of like a little bit just for public relations purposes, but they maintain the prices as they continue to go up and up and up, which is what we see in higher education and healthcare.
Yes, indeed. In fact, there was a physician that spoke to us, a free market-orientated physician who he and his partners operate a hospital in Oklahoma City that is really free market. All the prices are there. You want, a surgery of some kind or another. You know what it's going to cost you. The doctor knows what he's going to get out of it and everything. It's really a very different model. And he talked about how insurance companies are not at all interested in keeping costs down. They basically just pass it on, and they're basically they will mark something up and then pretend that they're giving you a great discount. Like if you go to a store and buy a shirt for $80 and they mark it down to $29, you say, "Wow, what a deal I've gotten." Well, it should never have been anywhere near $80 to start with. But there's that kind of lack of competition that seems to be so much a part of what's going on. And I just wonder if you don't think if we had a sound monetary system, where money wasn't created out of thin air and people had to start dealing with the scarcity of money, if that might not also be a solution, although I don't hold my breath in terms of expecting the Fed or anybody to go back to that sort of a honest monetary system. Would that help?
I think definitely it would, in the sense that we wouldn't be relying on credit to save us. In other words, the solution now is, well, the federal government should borrow another $1 trillion and give it away to somebody, and then that's the solution. The problem with credit, as we all know, is debt has interest. It accrues interest, and you have to pay principal and interest. And so even the government, despite its tremendous size, eventually you get eaten alive if you're living on borrowed money, and that's the long-term concern. with economists looking at the federal debt and as well as corporate debt and household debt is eventually all of your future earnings are devoted to servicing debt, and you don't have anything left to invest in the future. And that may be one reason why productivity has been declining or stagnating in the U.S. Like we're not investing wisely. We seem to be spending our way into a hole rather than investing in productive assets and training.
Well, the answer, of course, is just to suppress interest rates. That's the answer we're given. Just, the economy is slow. What you do is just drive interest. You create more money out of nothing, flood the markets, push the interest rates down, right? That's what they've been doing. How can that come to an end? Which sort of leads me to another topic I'd like to ask you about. You've written more recently, I think even perhaps today, you wrote on a blog, 3 bubbles / strikes and you're out. You're sort of suggesting that, for those people that are expecting that the Fed and the central banks can bubble their way out of trouble, again, this being the third bubble, the first being the dot-com, the next the housing bubble, and now the central banker bubble, your article sort of suggests that there's sort of ultimately self-correcting dynamics in play in markets that cannot be overcome by more of the same bad policies. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. I love your phrase self-correcting dynamics, because that's exactly what we're talking about. Is there are inner limits to this idea that you keep extending credit to more marginal borrowers and more marginal enterprises, and that it's all going to work out. Because as we all know, the classic business cycle is basically a credit cycle where credit becomes available and credit-worthy borrowers are able to borrow, and then they leverage that new money into new houses and productive investments. Where at the end of the credit cycle, which is where a lot of people feel we are now, then credit is being extended to uncreditworthy people who are basically have marginal qualifications to borrow more money than they already have. And so those are the people and the enterprises which are most likely to default, right? As soon as there's a pullback or a mild recession or their income declines, or there's a family emergency, or the enterprise is no longer profitable. Any kind of disruption will cause them to default, and then those defaults tend to domino, right? As people lose their jobs, then they default, and once the businesses they were supported by those people's spending, then their income declines, and so on. So this is a normal business cycle, and it's been basically delayed or pushed forward by the Federal Reserve's action of just, as you say, super low interest rates and unlimited liquidity. So the marginal borrowers and lenders have all been kept afloat, and they're actually dragging the whole economy down because they're dead weight. They're not really supporting productive investment. It's been consumption, but consumption is not investment.
Yeah, that's all they know, though, basically. And one other topic I'd like to ask you to comment on briefly is the .com, or let's say the Bitcoin markets. Now, you had another very interesting article. What will take? Or I forget exactly how it was. What will self-destruct first? Will it be Bitcoin or fiat currencies? That's not exactly the title, but that's the idea, I think, behind it. With the last couple of minutes left here, can you just comment on that article, perhaps pass along to our listeners what you were saying there?
Yeah, of course, we're all interested in the Bitcoin cryptocurrency phenomenon, and we all know that actually nobody knows exactly how it's going to play out, because this is a very new technology. I mean, it's like 8 years old, right? It's kind of like predicting the internet in 1995 or something. It's very, we're all guessing. And so I think we should always be skeptical of anybody's so-called expert opinion about how it's going to play out. We don't know. And I think for those of us that lived through the .com bubble, we can't really tell yet whether cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin are like the pets.com version, like some kind of grand idea that didn't actually pan out and went bust? Or is it sort of like Amazon, which was an idea that actually, has taken off and become a dominant industry? So there's a lot of opinion on all sides, and it certainly, to me, has the potential to become not the equivalent of Amazon, but an integral part of our economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, you certainly do point out that at least Bitcoin is limited in the number of units that can be created. I think you mentioned that in the article, whereas the dollar has unlimited amounts of, it's infinite in its numbers that can be created, the quantity of money. So that's one thing it has going for it. But boy, both of them are. What is the intrinsic value of both of them? And that's a big question, I guess. Well, anyway, Charles, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. We are basically out of time. It's of2minds.com. I would really suggest strongly to my listeners to go there, learn to know Charles and what he's writing about. And Charles, your work is basically paid for by people who donate. They find your work worthwhile, and they contribute to it. And I know my wife sent a small check to you because she loves your work and finds it to be, as do I. Every time I see you on Zero Hedge, I grab it and read it, and I will be going to your website to read it as well. So thank you very much for being with us. Very good to have you, and I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Me too, Jay. Thank you so much for such an informed series of questions and topics. I loved it.